Two beings standing at the foot of his bed in the dead of night. Not glowing, not gentle. Enoch said they were like nothing he'd ever seen on earth, their faces shining like the sun, their eyes like burning lamps, and they just stood there, watching him. He was so terrified he couldn't move, couldn't speak, and he genuinely thought he was dying in his sleep. He wasn't dying. He was about to be the second man in human history to leave Earth without dying at all. And what he saw on the other side, 10 levels of heaven, each one stranger than the last, fire that doesn't burn, rivers made of honey, angels in chains who haven't moved in thousands of years. Most people who've heard of the Book of Enoch have never even heard this part exists. Enoch was 365 years old when this happened, and if you know your Genesis, you already clocked that number isn't random. It's the same as the days in a solar year, and ancient readers absolutely noticed that. He was the great-grandfather of Noah, the father of Methuselah, and the Bible gives him exactly one line about how his life ended. God took him. No death, no burial, just gone. Only one other person in the entire Old Testament gets that treatment, and that's Elijah, centuries later, in a chariot of fire. So when these two towering beings show up at his bed, Enoch isn't being punished, he's being recruited. They tell him to get up, that he's going on a journey, and that he needs to brief his sons because he isn't coming back down for a long, long time. He gets up, he goes outside, and the ground disappears from under his feet. The first heaven, according to the text, sits just above the sky you and I actually see, what ancient cosmology called the firmament. And it's not full of harps and clouds in the cartoon sense, it's full of machinery. Enoch describes massive storehouses, actual reservoirs for snow and for dew, with angels assigned to each one, like supervisors on a shift. There's a sea suspended above the clouds, held in place by nothing visible. There are angels who control the rain. There are angels who steer the stars across the sky like they're driving vehicles on a track. The whole point of this level isn't beauty, it's order. Weather isn't random, it's administered. And if that doesn't already mess with your head a little, hang on, because heaven too is where it gets dark. Literally. No light. None. Enoch says the second heaven is just darkness, and hanging in that darkness are angels, chained, weeping, waiting. These are described as the ones who joined the original rebellion against God, and they are already sentenced. They're not being punished yet. They're in a holding cell, waiting for a court date that hasn't come. Here's the detail almost nobody clocks on a first read. This is not the same group of fallen angels everyone associates with the Book of Enoch, the ones who came down to earth and married human women back in the days of Jared, Enoch's own father. That story, the famous one, the genetic tampering, giant-making one, that's a different group, locked in a different heaven, and we have not gotten there yet. So you've now got one set of fallen angels chained in heaven too. And somewhere up ahead, there's a second set in a totally different location, doing something very different while they wait. Why would there be two separate prisons for two separate rebellions? That's not a throwaway detail, and it's going to matter a lot more in a few minutes. Third heaven is where the text finally slows down and lets you breathe for about 90 seconds. This is paradise in the literal geographic sense. Enoch describes an orchard so beautiful that every tree was in full flower, fruit ripening on branches at the exact same time other branches are still blooming, which is the writer's way of telling you the laws of growing seasons simply don't apply here. Dead center of the garden stands the tree of life, golden, flame-colored, with a fragrance Enoch says is unlike anything on earth. And from underneath that tree, 4 rivers break out and flow downward, feeding the earthly Garden of Eden below it. One of milk, one of honey, one of wine, and one of oil. 300 angels are stationed there permanently, tending it, singing without ever stopping, in voices Enoch can't even describe properly because human language doesn't have the right words. This is, by the way, almost certainly the exact same location the Apostle Paul is talking about in 2 Corinthians 12, when he says he was caught up to the third heaven and heard things that cannot be told. Different writer, different century, same coordinate on the map. But Enoch's guides don't let him linger. They walk him to the northern edge of that exact same heaven, and the temperature drops to something he has no words for either, just in the opposite direction. Same level, same heaven, completely different climate, ice and fire existing in the same space at once, somehow not canceling each other out, a river of fire cutting through frozen ground, and cruel-looking angels carrying weapons, standing watch over people who are being punished there. Described in the text with worms that never stop, cold that never breaks, fire that never goes out. Paradise and judgment sitting on opposite ends of the exact same heaven, separated by nothing but a walk. So now you've got 2 prison populations of fallen angels in 2 different places, and a paradise and a hell sitting by each other in heaven 3. None of this is set up as random scenery. Every single piece comes back. Keep both of those threads in your pocket, because heaven 5 is going to answer one of them in a way that genuinely surprised me the first time I read it. For now, Enoch's getting moved again, and this time they're showing him the sky. 4th heaven is the engine room for the sun and the moon, and this is where the imagery gets genuinely wild. The sun in this text doesn't just rise, it's pulled on a flaming chariot by creatures called phoenixes and chocodri. The chocodri are barely talked about anywhere, and they're worth pausing on because they're not what you'd picture. Enoch describes them with the heads and tails of crocodiles, the bodies of serpents, 12 wings each, the color of the rainbow, and their job is to sing together every single morning at the exact moment the sun rises, as if their song is what cues the light to come up. The phoenixes do the same job, just slightly offset, almost like a relay team handing off the sunrise to one another. Every bird, every animal on earth, Enoch's told, waits with wings spread for that song to finish before the sun is actually allowed to shine. The text is basically saying the sunrise you saw this morning had a soundtrack you weren't able to hear. Before we go any further up, there's something waiting for Enoch at the very end of this trip that almost nobody brings up when they talk about the Book of Enoch. It's not about angels, it's not about heaven at all. It's about what he's handed before he's sent back down to earth, and it's going to reframe everything you think you know about why this story even got written down in the first place. Hold that thought, we're closing in on it. 6th heaven is run by archangels, and it functions almost like mission control for the entire planet. Enoch sees 7 bands of bright angels, each one assigned a different department: the changing of the seasons, the rivers, the fruit of the trees, every living thing that grows from the ground, the souls of men, every good and useful thing that exists on earth. It's bureaucratic in the strangest, most fascinating way. Heaven, in this telling, runs less like a throne room and more like a control center with departments that never stop working. And tucked into this level are recording angels, beings whose entire job every day is writing down the deeds and the souls of every human who has ever lived.
This is almost certainly part of where later Jewish and Christian writers got the idea of heavenly books tracking every life, the same concept Revelation leans on centuries later when it talks about books being opened at judgment. From here, things move fast because Enoch himself says he's now too terrified to process it slowly. Heaven's seven, fiery armies of archangels in formation, and many-eyed ones, almost certainly cherubim and seraphim, singing in a chorus so massive Enoch has to be physically held up by his guides because his legs stop working under him. Heaven 8, called Muzaloth. This is where the zodiac signs and the changing of seasons are regulated from, not worshipped, administered, the same way weather was administered back in Heaven 1. Heaven 9, Kuchavim, described as the literal heavenly homes of those same 12 constellations, like each sign has an actual address up here. And then Heaven 10, Aravath, the highest level there is. This is where God's throne sits, and Enoch's description of seeing God's face is one of the most intense passages in the entire text. He says it looked like iron pulled glowing hot from a furnace, throwing off sparks, and that the sight was, in his words, supremely awesome and supremely frightening at the same time. Not comforting, not warm, overwhelming in the most literal sense, to the point that his own angelic guides have to physically pick him up because he can no longer stand. And this is where mini mystery number 2 gets answered. The archangel Michael steps in personally, and he does something the text describes almost like a surgical procedure. He removes Enoch from his earthly clothing, his physical body, essentially, and anoints him with oil that Enoch says smells sweeter than any sweet-smelling thing. Afterward, he looks at his own hands, and there's no difference between himself and the glorious being standing around him. He's been changed, permanently. But God doesn't let him stay yet. He's sent back down to earth for exactly 30 days with one job: write down everything he's just been shown, every level, every detail. Enoch comes back and produces, according to the text, 366 books for his sons to pass down to future generations, sits with them, teaches them everything, and then the same 2 angels who first appeared at his bedside come back one final time and take him up for good. No funeral, no body left behind, just gone, the same way he arrived in the first place. Ken Johnson has pointed out something genuinely fascinating here. Enoch is technically the first human being in the entire biblical record to be taken bodily out of this world without dying, centuries before Elijah's chariot, long before anyone wrote the word rapture. Whatever you think theologically about that connection, it's worth sitting with for a second.
Now, here's where I owe you the full picture, because I'm not going to dress this up as something it isn't. This particular tour of heaven account doesn't actually come from the same manuscripts as the Book of Enoch fragments found at Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those fragments are real, ancient, and they back up a different section of Enoch's writings. This 10 heavens journey comes from a separate text scholars call Second Enoch, preserved only in Slavonic manuscripts, and for roughly 1,200 years it basically vanished from history before resurfacing. We don't know for certain who wrote it, or exactly when. That uncertainty is precisely why it sits outside Scripture, and why Ken is so consistent about saying it always will. What it gives us isn't doctrine. It's a genuinely remarkable look into how ancient people, Jewish and early Christian alike, pictured the architecture of heaven long before anyone reading this video was born. That's valuable on its own. It doesn't need to be Scripture to be worth understanding. If this is the kind of deep dive you actually want more of, Ken's full commentary on all 3 Enoch texts is linked in the description. That's the real, unfiltered source material, and it goes about 10 times deeper than I have time for in 20 minutes. Subscribe if you want the next one when it drops. Next time, we're going back down to the bottom of that 5th heaven. because there's a reason those 200 watchers went looking for human wives in the first place, and the answer is stranger than almost anyone expects.